Hey there, welcome to another episode of completely unnecessary historical knowledge you'll probably recite at a party where no one asked. Today, we're diving headfirst into the shimmering, powdered, gold-encrusted fever dream that was the Palace of Versailles, a place that looked like it was designed by a drunk chandelier, smelled like wet wigs and ambition, and operated about as smoothly as a haunted Chuck E. Cheese run by aristocrats. If you've ever worked in retail and thought, wow, customers treat me like I'm invisible, imagine being a servant at Versailles, where invisibility was your actual job description, right after silent, exhausted, and please don't die in the hallway again. Before we start, drop a comment and let me know if you're tuning in from your night shift, stuck in traffic, or free-falling through the YouTube abyss while eating cold pasta straight from the container. Just maybe don't comment while driving. I love knowing how far we've all collectively fallen, but let's not add commented mid-commute to the obituary, yeah? Oh, and if you're using this to fall asleep, feel free to drop the play speed to like 0.9 or whatever. It makes me sound even more bored with history. So, perfect. So, Versailles. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1600s. Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King because subtlety wasn't invented yet, decided Paris just wasn't grand enough. Or maybe he just didn't like being stabbed by nobles. Either way, he built this palace/glittering authoritarian petting zoo out in the swamps of Versailles, turning a hunting lodge into what would eventually become the largest, most absurdly opulent building in Europe. It had over 2,300 rooms. That's not a typo. 2,300 rooms. That's more rooms than most people have decisions in a week. The whole place was stuffed with mirrors, marble, fountains, statues, and about 14 billion square feet of decorative moulding, all designed to remind everyone that the king was not just in charge, but also possibly God's landlord. But Versailles wasn't just a building. It was a functioning ecosystem powered entirely by powdered people scurrying around with the quiet desperation of unpaid interns at a Fashion Week gala. Enter the servants. There were over 3,000 of them. And don't get excited. This wasn't 3,000 people all taking turns lighting candles and eating leftover macarons in the king's personal escape room. No, the vast majority of these folks never even saw the king, let alone spoke to him. They were the human wallpaper of Versailles, living props who existed to keep the gears of ceremonial nonsense turning. The highest-ranking servants, of course, were nobles. Yep, aristocrats fought tooth and powdered nail for the privilege of handing the king his shirt, because proximity to royal armpit sweat was considered a status symbol. There were dukes whose entire job was to hold a bowl of water while Louis XIV rinsed his pinky finger. And they did this proudly. Meanwhile, the lowest-ranking servants lived in attic crawl spaces, so cramped and sweltering that sleeping there felt like being slow-roasted in a wooden coffin full of mothballs and disappointment. No privacy, no ventilation, no heat in winter. Some rooms were just big enough to lie down in, assuming you didn't mind your head being inches from the ceiling and your feet dangling off the edge like some kind of half-baked servant kebab. And no, most of them weren't paid. They were in service, which is just fancy speak for free labour in exchange for the vague hope that one day someone will mistake you for important. Even today, unpaid internships don't require you to scrub chamber pots before sunrise, usually. Speaking of sunrise, that's when the workday started. Not because things had to get done. No, that would be too logical. But because the king's schedule dictated reality. If Louis wanted to roll over at 6:15 a.m., 20 people had to be standing by his bed, silently in full wig and waistcoat, ready to witness that divine moment when His Majesty deigned to blink. That was a real job, watching the king wake up. There were people assigned to hold the curtain, people assigned to warm the slippers, people assigned to pass the slippers, people who passed the passer of the slippers. It was like an assembly line of awkward eye contact and crusty brocade. Imagine being so obsessed with hierarchy that you create a system where someone could be ranked too low to hand you your own pants. That's Versailles. And then there were the honorary servants. These were nobles who didn't need jobs but wanted one. Specifically, one that let them be seen ladling soup or fluffing cushions within royal eyesight. To clarify, people were fighting for the chance to work for free, in heels, in front of a king who probably smelled like a damp raccoon soaked in brandy. But hey, status is everything. The palace itself functioned like a dysfunctional cruise ship. Too many people, not enough space, random screaming, and a strong smell of mildew with undertones of urine and betrayal. It was meant to showcase the grandeur of France, but behind the gold-leafed doors and 300-foot-long hallways, the entire system ran on stress, sweat, and a kind of barely contained panic that makes today's service industry look like a day spa. Some servants ran errands through icy corridors in the winter wearing shoes made out of what I can only assume was disappointment and scrap leather. Others were posted in the hallways 12 hours a day, doing nothing but standing silently and pretending not to hear the nobles arguing about wigs or syphilis. There were even rules about how many steps you could take when approaching someone of higher rank. Too many steps? Disrespect. Too few? Insult. Did you bow incorrectly? Congratulations, you might now be reassigned to lizard removal duty in the servant latrines. And just to drive the point home, Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a performance. Everything, the meals, the rituals, the greetings, that was theatre. Everyone was acting all the time. If you dropped a spoon or sneezed too loudly, you weren't just clumsy. You were publicly humiliating the monarchy. Servants were expected to be perfectly invisible, yet instantly available, unnoticeable, yet flawless. It was like working as a waiter, therapist, ninja, and furniture piece all at once. And if you're wondering how this worked in terms of basic human needs, like food, water, privacy, or not melting into a puddle of anxiety, it didn't. The average servant lived on watery broth, slept in a room hotter than the inside of a microwave burrito, and was expected to maintain complete loyalty to a system that thought of them as breathing chandeliers. But it gets better, or worse depending on your perspective, because we haven't even talked about cleanliness yet. You'd think a place that sparkled like the inside of a cursed jewelry box would at least have a decent hygiene routine, right? Oh no, baby. Versailles might have had marble bathtubs, perfume fountains, and entire rooms devoted to dressing. But when it came to actual cleanliness, well, let's just say the royal scent was less clean linen and more medicated sherry mixed with ancient foot. Coming up next, how water was feared like it owed people money, why the king was massaged with vodka instead of ever taking a bath, and which unfortunate servant got to hold the towel while he exfoliated his royal undercarriage. Because yes, that was also a real job. So stick around, this rabbit hole is only getting weirder. Let's talk about hygiene. And I use that term with the loosest possible definition. Like, if hygiene were a houseplant, Versailles kept it in a dark closet and watered it with wine once a year. So, here's the thing. Versailles was a place where you could find 300-foot mirrors, gold leaf on ceilings, and powdered wigs so tall they needed their own life insurance policy. But soap? That was suspicious. See, in the 17th and 18th centuries, people genuinely believed that water, actual clean water, could seep into your skin and somehow invite disease to waltz into your bloodstream like it was showing up fashionably late to a syphilis-themed masquerade. This was considered science. The king, good old Louis XIV, human disco ball and part-time sun deity, didn't bathe. Not like you're picturing. No bubbles, no rubber duck, no soulful thinking music echoing off marble tiles. Instead, he preferred a dry bath, which basically meant he had alcohol-soaked rags rubbed over his body. By servants, with their hands, no gloves, So imagine it's 5 a.m, you haven't eaten, you live in a wooden cupboard the size of a kitchen drawer, and your first task of the day is to exfoliate a monarch using brandy and regret. And this wasn't just a quick scrub either. There was a whole ritual for the king's toilette, which, just to be clear, wasn't the bathroom. It was an elaborate ceremony in which he got dressed, powdered, moisturized, stared at, and mildly blessed by half the nobility while standing mostly naked. And if you were a servant, well, if you were important enough, you got to hand the king his pants. If you weren't, you just stood there for hours, holding a tray, watching, occasionally nodding solemnly at a sock. Every step of the king's grooming had its own designated person. There was a guy for the shirt, a guy for the comb, someone for the wig, which, let's be honest, looked like a raccoon curled up for winter. And yes, there was even someone to dab the royal armpits with perfumed cloth. His job title? Something like Gentleman of the Perspiration. And don't go thinking this was done in private either. This was a public event. Courtiers watched this like it was a TED Talk. You had nobles who camped out for the chance to say bonjour while His Majesty adjusted his garters. It was like winning backstage passes to a man putting on trousers. Now, let's talk about what happened when the king needed to go. Yes, that. Because even that had a process. See, the king didn't just sneak off to the bathroom like a normal person. He had a commode royale, basically a gold-trimmed wooden throne with a chamber pot inside, right in the room, sometimes behind a screen, sometimes not. Because privacy? That was for peasants. And yes, there was a person whose job was to stand by while the king did the royal business, and then respectfully remove the evidence, like a valet for your poop. And this wasn't a punishment job. Oh no, it was an honour. Nobles fought to do this. They wrote letters to get on the list. Imagine begging your way into a position where you get to hold a golden bucket of human waste and then bow afterward. Just for comparison, if you hate your boss, and let's face it, you probably do, at least you don't know what he smells like after a bowl of stewed eel. That puts things in perspective. Let's not forget the smells. Versailles had no air fresheners. Perfume was your only hope, and it was used liberally, not just on the king, but on everything. Wigs, curtains, handkerchiefs, probably the furniture. Anything to cover the fact that most people hadn't bathed since the Treaty of Westphalia. The king reportedly had over 1,000 perfumes in his collection. Servants had to remember which scent to apply depending on the season, his mood, or the alignment of Jupiter, probably. One day it was orange blossom. The next it was burnt myrtle with a hint of existential dread. And these weren't light spritzes. We're talking full-body olfactory assaults, the kind of perfume that enters your bloodstream and makes your ancestors sneeze. Now you might be wondering, where did these servants live? How did they wash themselves after massaging eau de toilette into the royal undercarriage? They didn't, or rarely. Bathing for servants was about as likely as a paid vacation, which is to say, non-existent. Most of them slept in little wooden crawl spaces under the rafters or above ballrooms, sweating out rosewater fumes while raccoons probably plotted coups in the walls. And if you did manage to get access to one of the few tubs scattered around the palace, you better bring your own bucket of water and your own dignity, because there's a good chance the last guy in there was an 83-year-old duke who thought lavender oil cured gout. So why didn't people riot about this? Because Versailles was a performance. Everyone was playing their part, pretending the smells weren't real, the sweat stains weren't spreading, and the fainting spells weren't from mild ammonia poisoning. And for servants, the job wasn't about comfort, it was about access. To be near the king, even if you were holding his chamber pot, meant you mattered more than the guy scrubbing vomit off the ballroom floor. Status trickled downhill. Unfortunately, so did other things. You couldn't complain, you couldn't refuse, and you definitely couldn't sneeze on the royal cuffs. You just showed up, powdered the back of a nobleman's neck, inhaled a lungful of musk, and hoped no one noticed your toenails falling off from untreated frostbite. And yes, someone had to clean the wigs, with powder, and sometimes with bread. Literal stale bread. They rubbed it into the wigs to absorb oil, then brushed it off. That's right, they were basically dry shampooing human hair nests with croutons. Again, this is a place where a man with gout sat on a toilet throne in front of an audience, but somehow cleaning wigs with yesterday's baguette is what pushes us over the edge. The thing is, if this is what passed for clean inside the palace, if powdered body rags and ceremonial armpit dabbing were the gold standard, just imagine what things were like outside. In the gardens, where all the chamber pots were emptied, where hundreds of servants wandered with full bladders, no toilets, and a lot of creative ideas. But we'll get there. For now, just remember this. The next time your boss sends you an annoying email, at least you don't have to spritz his thighs with rosemary vodka and call it service. And that's what passed for hygiene at the most glamorous place in Europe. Try not to think about it too hard while you're eating. So, you've just spent your morning dry rubbing the king's armpits with brandy-soaked linen, standing politely next to the royal toilet like it's your calling in life, and watching powdered nobles adjust their wigs like they're trying to communicate with aliens through complex hair signals. Great. Time to go outside and get some air, right? Oh, honey, no. Welcome to the gardens of Versailles. A breathtaking, meticulously sculpted hellscape where beauty, symmetry, and human waste existed in a deeply uncomfortable ménage à trois. See, for all its chandeliers and gold-plated narcissism, the Palace of Versailles had what we in the modern world might call a teensy infrastructure issue. Specifically, it had no real sewage system, which is kind of a bold design choice for a palace housing thousands of humans with functioning digestive tracts. Now, the nobles weren't going to concern themselves with minor details like, where does the poop go? No. That sort of high-concept thinking was left to the servants, or more accurately, ignored by the servants until it started physically touching their shoes. There were chamber pots, of course, ceramic vessels of horror that were supposed to be discreetly emptied into designated areas. But when you're dealing with an overworked staff and no plumbing, designated areas start to become loosely interpreted. Some were dumped out of windows, some were emptied into corners of hallways, some were just sort of forgotten, like unpaid parking tickets or exes you never technically broke up with. And then there were the gardens. Oh yes, those pristine, perfectly manicured walkways where statues of Roman gods judged you silently from every angle. You'd think such majestic grounds would be sacred. Spoiler, they weren't. They were basically Versailles' unofficial open-air toilet system. If you were a servant, your day could include such delightful duties as shoveling human waste off the gravel paths so the nobles could take their daily promenade without stepping in someone else's metaphorical Tuesday. Imagine raking leaves, except the leaves are warm, squishy, and legally classified as a biohazard. And don't even ask about the pit latrines. These were essentially decorative holes in the ground, often surrounded by Rococo stonework, because even your filth needed to be aesthetically pleasing. Using one was like relieving yourself into an architectural metaphor for everything wrong with 18th century France. And yes, the smell was exactly what you think it was, plus a whiff of lavender, because somebody thought perfume could fix it. It didn't. In fact, the stench got so bad that perfumes became the duct tape solution to everything. Got mold? Spray jasmine. Your clothes smell like death and despair. Rosewater. You're pretty sure you inhaled a rat's final breath this morning. Musk of civet, which, fun fact, was literally extracted from the anal glands of a wild cat. Versailles, where elegance met effluent. There are actual guest accounts, like written down, "Please help me, Jesus diaries," of people attending parties and stepping in something soft on their way to a fireworks show. That's the kind of phrase you don't want to hear unless you're describing a puppy, and even then, context matters. One ambassador reportedly described the gardens as charming, though one suspects he was suffering from diplomatic nose blindness, a real survival skill in a place where the air quality hovered somewhere between public urinal and old meat left in a violin case. And while Marie Antoinette was off play acting as a shepherdess in a custom-built fake village, yes, that was a real thing. Somewhere nearby, a servant was probably engaged in mortal combat with a rat the size of a dachshund that had developed a taste for discarded wig powder and human shame. And yes, the rats were bold. They weren't the shy kind that scurried away when you clapped. No, these were Versailles rats, aristocratic rodents with a sense of entitlement. They'd stare you down like, "Oh, were you planning to clean this hallway? Cute, I live here now." Even the tools used to clean this mess had a surreal level of pageantry. There are records of gold-leafed wheelbarrows used to collect filth. Let that settle in for a moment. Someone had to push a literal golden cart full of poop across a garden while trying not to lock eyes with passing nobility. That's not a job. That's a Greek tragedy with a budget. And let's not forget, everything in Versailles was about appearances, so you couldn't just toss the waste and move on. No. It had to be done quietly, efficiently, and without offending the delicate senses of someone wearing 6 pounds of brocade and thinking hard about how to ruin your life with a raised eyebrow. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the overuse of perfumes, meant to cover the outside stench, created a new horror for the servants. Chemical warfare by fragrance. These weren't just pleasant scents. These were aggressive, unregulated potions made from crushed flowers, animal glands, and whatever essence the apothecary found behind the barn. Breathing this in daily meant that many servants probably walked around in a constant state of low-grade hallucination. There's a good chance that some of those polite nods were just people trying not to pass out from bergamot fumes. You know that moment when you walk into a candle store and the smell hits you so hard it rewrites your childhood memories? Now imagine that, but mixed with compost, burning tallow, and something that may have once been cabbage. That was Versailles. It was like living inside a scented candle designed by Satan's wedding planner. And the kicker? Despite all of this, the waste, the rats, the stench, the trauma, you couldn't complain. You were lucky to be there, literally. Getting a servant job at Versailles was considered an honour. There were people who fought, bribed, and begged for the chance to scrub royal skid marks off marble steps. Because at least it meant you were close to power, close enough to smell it. Unfortunately. And remember, this is just the outdoor situation. We haven't even talked about the kitchens yet. The logistics of food service in a palace where it could take longer to deliver a meal than to invent democracy. But we'll get there. And it's a ride. Just keep in mind, the next time someone says, the past was simpler, you can now confidently answer, yeah, simpler, if you ignore the flying feces and the perfume-induced seizures. All right, you've braved the slippery, filth-caked corridors of Versailles, endured the royal rinse and pat routine, and powered through the stench of rotting lavender, wafting from a sun-baked latrine. Congratulations on a job. Done. You're now worthy of a seat at the royal table. Well, not at the table. Near it. Behind it. Somewhere in the architectural zip code of the table, holding a napkin like it's the Shroud of Turin, while the king nibbles on goose pâté and pretends you don't exist. Let's talk about food service at Versailles. Now, you'd think in a palace famous for gold chandeliers and wigs the size of small boats, food would be the one area where things made sense. Logical, streamlined, maybe even pleasant. No, absolutely not. Serving food at Versailles was like participating in a 17th century escape room designed by Kafka and catered by someone who had never seen a kitchen. The whole thing was run through this labyrinthine bureaucracy called the Maison du Roi, the king's household, which sounds cozy, like a place where you might be offered tea and a biscotti. But no, it was more like a government agency that operated as if every spoon required 5 signatures and a Latin blessing. There were offices for every food-related function. You had the paneterie for bread, the échansonnerie for drinks, the cuisine bouche for the king's actual meals, and the fruiterie for whatever noble fruit salad crisis might arise. This meant that getting a roast duck from the kitchen to the king's plate involved, conservatively, 47 people, 2 ceremonial towels, and a man whose entire job was to carry the duck, but only if someone else opened the door first. If you were a servant stuck at the bottom of this food chain, you could spend 6 hours waiting for your turn to carry just the gravy boat. And if you missed your cue, you started over, from the beginning, with a new gravy boat, because the previous one had cooled to a temperature considered unholy. And don't even think about refilling the wine unless someone with a fancier title said something like, "Yes, refill the wine," preferably in French, and preferably while not making eye contact. There are reports of under-butlers hovering behind noblemen like anxious pigeons, waiting for a barely perceptible head tilt that meant more Burgundy, peasant. Now, let's pause to appreciate the truly psychotic logistics. The Palace of Versailles was massive. We're talking over 2,300 rooms, nearly as many windows. Window cleaners would need a lifetime contract, and more than one hallway that felt like it had its own time zone. So, when it came to food delivery, the kitchens were naturally located in a totally different building. Of course. Why? Because fire was a risk, and aristocrats didn't want their wigs going up in smoke over some peasant's botched soufflé. So the food was made far away and then carried lovingly, tragically, by exhausted servants through courtyards, wind tunnels, and occasionally light drizzle, all to arrive lukewarm at best. Imagine being a scullery boy, sprinting across gravel in silk stockings, holding a tray of quail like it's a newborn infant, while a swan hisses at you because it outranks you socially. Servants were expected to act invisible, emotionless, and immune to the smells wafting off roasted meats and glistening desserts. Many were unpaid, underfed, and trapped in a situation where the food they were delivering looked like it had been hand-prepared by angels and tasted like betrayal. So, naturally, they stole. Not in big, dramatic ways. No one was shoving a pheasant under their tunic and dashing into the woods, but they'd sneak a lick off the ladle, palm a candied walnut, or nibble on a fallen tart crust like it was a rare truffle. These weren't acts of greed. They were survival tactics. One wrong whiff of something delicious, and suddenly you're licking a butter knife behind a curtain like a raccoon in formal wear. There were even coded phrases for this sort of thing. Cleaning the tray often meant shoving your face into whatever's left without leaving teeth marks. Stories spread of servants getting fired, or worse, reassigned, for daring to look too interested in a duck confit. And you did not want to be reassigned. That usually meant going from food duty to chamber pot duty, from turkey legs to turds. Also, let's talk about the fires, because of course there were fires. You've got a medieval kitchen with open flames, flammable wigs, and half the staff running around on stress-induced autopilot. Some historians estimate that minor kitchen fires were so common they stopped recording them in the palace logs. One blaze in 1722 reportedly destroyed an entire wing of the service quarters. The official cause? Unattended pudding. And then there was the internal politics, the backstabbing, the whispering, the absolute cutthroat social climbing that made Game of Thrones look like a trust-building retreat. A footman might sabotage a rival's soup route just to curry favour with a duke's cousin. Serving food became a kind of operatic battlefield where your greatest weapon was strategic tray placement, and your deadliest enemy was the guy with slightly better shoe buckles. And all of this, all of it, was performed under constant humiliating observation. The king often ate alone, but it was never a private moment. No, dozens of people would stand in stiff silence just to watch him eat. Courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, high-ranking nobles, all standing there like creepy mannequins at a food court murder mystery. There were roles where a servant's whole job was to hold the king's napkin, or his salt, or just stand near the butter. Some of them didn't even do anything. They just stood there, holding a plate, looking useful, like historical paperweights in embroidered breeches, and God forbid you drop something. A servant once tripped during a royal breakfast and spilled milk on the king's sleeve. He was dismissed immediately. No trial, no apology. 1 minute you're holding a carafe, the next minute you're sleeping in a ditch, wondering how your entire life unravelled because of a rogue cheese rind. So yes, modern food service is hard. No one's denying that. But at least at Olive Garden, when you mess up an order, your boss doesn't exile you to latrine detail or publicly question your lineage. At Versailles, the pressure wasn't just about service. It was about spectacle. Everything was theatre. Your posture mattered. Your silence mattered. Your ability to pass a spoon in a way that said, "I am invisible but eternally loyal" mattered. And over time, this kind of psychological chokehold did things to people. Weird things. We'll get into that next. The unravelling, the paranoia, the endless performance of dignity under surveillance. Because Versailles wasn't just a gilded hellhole. It was also a reality show where you could lose your job, your mind, and your identity in one poorly timed bow. And now we descend into the final act. What happens when you live in a palace but sleep in a box and no one ever calls you by name? You sleep in a cardboard box behind the dumpster, except instead of Ferraris, it's jewel-encrusted soup spoons, and instead of a dumpster, it's a crawl space above a ballroom that smells like roasted swan, mouldy wood, and 17 decades of anxiety sweat. Time to coast through the last hallway or 12. We've reached the end zone of Versailles, where the floors were polished with tears, the chandeliers hung heavier than social expectations, and the staff were so emotionally depleted they practically moved by muscle memory alone. They made Victorian butlers look like they were on spring break in Cabo, with zero regrets. Let's talk about what it actually felt like to be a servant in this shimmering, unventilated fever dream of a palace. First of all, imagine waking up every morning and remembering that your entire job is to not exist too loudly. Like, if your shoes make noise, fired. If you sigh too close to a duke, demoted to rat wrangler. If your face twitches while holding the king's toothbrush, which, by the way, was basically a stick dipped in soot and lies, congratulations, you've just dishonoured your bloodline. The pressure to perform invisible perfection was so intense that many servants developed what modern psychologists might call complete personality liquefaction. You weren't a person. You were a moving part in a performance where everyone was faking it. The nobles were pretending to be demigods, and the servants were pretending not to smell them. Now, if you think your job has no upward mobility, allow me to introduce you to 18th century Versailles, where the only way to get promoted was to either marry someone with a title, inherit someone else's death, or accidentally save a noble from choking on a candied quail. And even then, you might just get reassigned from holder of the royal gloves to guy who lights the king's indoor fireworks. Not a joke. That was a real job. Someone had to do it. Usually while drunk, usually during dinner, sometimes during childbirth. Honestly, it was a whole vibe. Let's also not forget the social limbo of it all. Servants were expected to be constantly present, yet emotionally absent, like Alexa with slightly worse posture. You were there to absorb noble tantrums, fetch things they couldn't be bothered to lift, like their own handkerchiefs, and occasionally participate in casual abuse dressed up as tradition. Imagine being screamed at by a duchess because the ribbon on her dog's wig was slightly askew, and knowing you couldn't even blink aggressively in response without risking your job and your kidneys. And even outside the palace, Versailles servants were stuck. You couldn't mingle with commoners, too fancy. Couldn't dine with nobles, too common. So you mostly just hovered in this weird social Bermuda triangle, like a haunted velvet curtain that occasionally fetched soup. A lot of them tried to keep a double life, sneaking off after hours to see family, engage in forbidden romances, or just, breathe without judgment. But that too came with risk. Get caught having a beer with a stable boy, and suddenly you're reassigned to dusting portraits of the king's dead relatives, which sounds fine until you realize one of them was stuffed. Not stuffed with food. Stuffed. Like taxidermy. By the late 1700s, the cracks were showing, mentally, literally, structurally. Imagine working 16 hours a day just to help someone else get powdered, perfumed and praised for doing absolutely nothing except being born with a hyphenated last name and no chin. It wears on you. Some servants just snapped. Others got sick. From the mould, the fumes, the poor diet, the lead-based makeup particles floating through the air like glittery death pollen. And others started to whisper things, dangerous things, revolutionary things. Because, here's the final insult. When the revolution came, when the gates were stormed and heads began to roll like rotten cabbages down a cobblestone hill, nobody stopped to ask if the servants wanted that. Sure, some joined in, grabbed pitchforks, cheered on guillotines, but many were just there, stuck in the blast zone between privilege and poverty. They weren't rich enough to matter, and not poor enough to escape notice. So, they got swept up like everyone else, trampled by history with no footnote, no monument, and definitely no severance pay. And that, my friends, is how you go from hand-feeding grapes to a guy in velvet socks, to collateral damage in a revolution that smelled like armpits and righteous fury. So the next time you're annoyed because your boss sends Slack messages at 10 p.m, remember, at least you're not spooning soup for someone who thinks bathing will dissolve their soul. Or worse, powdering the underside of a monarch while being watched by 30 silent men in wigs. Versailles was beautiful. Versailles was iconic. Versailles was a glittering hellscape for the people who made it run. The thousands of silent ghosts in aprons who kept the machine humming until it finally imploded in a spray of blood, perfume, and very angry bakers. Anyway, I'm off to scrub my brain with lavender and forget everything I just said. You should probably do the same. Or don't. Maybe you're driving to work. Maybe you're stuck in bed, eyes wide open, wondering how you ended up listening to a stranger talk about 18th century plumbing disasters. Either way, sleep tight or drive safe. And if you see anyone wearing silk breeches and asking for a chamber pot, run. Just run.